The morning of November 23, 1962 began without ceremony. Youngstown, Ohio, a steel city, gray skies and factory smoke and streets that smelled of iron. A Saturday. Families had gathered. Stores were open. Children played near the curbs on the north side. At 2:45 in the afternoon, a 1962 Cadillac parked on a residential block detonated. The device had been placed beneath the driver's seat. It was a clean placement, deliberate, practiced, positioned for maximum upward force. The two men inside never had the opportunity to react. The mechanism was too fast for that. The sound carried for 6 blocks. Windows shattered on both sides of the street. A woman watering her front yard was knocked to the ground by the pressure wave. A 12-year-old boy standing on the opposite sidewalk. He would not speak about this publicly for more than 60 years. Described the event afterward as the sky coming apart. He meant it literally. The air itself seemed to rupture. The Cadillac lifted, not dramatically, not the way film depicts it. It rose perhaps 2 feet and settled back down into a different shape, a shape that was no longer a car. Fire spread from the engine compartment in the first seconds. Smoke rose into the November air in a column that was visible from the highway. By the time the fire department arrived, 11 minutes after the first call, there was nothing left to save. And by the time the fire department arrived, Youngstown had already become something else. Not a steel city, not an industrial center, not a working-class community fighting to survive. It had become something harder to name, a place where the machinery of civic life, the police department, the sheriff's office, the prosecutor's office, the offices of elected officials at every level, had been so thoroughly integrated into the infrastructure of organized crime that the explosion on that Saturday afternoon was not, in any meaningful institutional sense, being investigated. It was being managed. This is not conjecture. It is documented in federal court records, in congressional testimony, in the records of the FBI field office that had been monitoring Mahoning County since the late 1940s, and in the investigative journalism that would eventually force the question into national view. The corruption in Youngstown was not incidental, it was architectural. And to understand what happened after the explosion, to understand why 82 bombings in a single American city produced not a single conviction, you have to understand what had been built in the Mahoning Valley before the first bomb was ever placed. 3 questions define everything that followed the explosion on November 23, 1962. Why did 82 bombings go officially unsolved in a city with a functioning police department? Why did 2 organized crime families, one based in Cleveland, one based in Pittsburgh, fight a territorial war over a mid-sized Ohio steel town? And how did the corruption that permitted it all not only survive the conflict, but outlast the city itself? Those questions do not have simple answers, but they have structural ones. And structure is where this story begins. Youngstown sits in the Mahoning Valley in northeastern Ohio, roughly equidistant between Cleveland and Pittsburgh. It is not and was never a metropolis. It did not have the scale or the political complexity of Chicago or New York or Detroit. But for a specific period in American industrial history, roughly 1930 through 1970, it had something more valuable than scale. It had a concentration of cash, a concentration of workers, and a concentration of institutional weakness. The steel industry had transformed the Mahoning Valley. Republic Steel, U.S. Steel, Youngstown Sheet and Tube. These were not factories in any ordinary sense. They were economic ecosystems, tens of thousands of workers, entire neighborhoods organized around mill schedules, bars that opened at 6 in the morning because the night shift ended at 5:30, a city where a man could earn a living wage without ever requiring a formal education, and where the principal activity outside of work was, for large portions of the male population, gambling. Numbers running, the street lottery of the industrial poor, was not invented in Youngstown, but the conditions of the Mahoning Valley were almost perfectly suited to its expansion. The bets were small, the transactions were cash and informal. The operation required no storefront, no license, no infrastructure beyond a system of trust. And the margins were extraordinary. Here is how the Youngstown number system actually worked, not in the abstract, but in its operational detail. At the base level were the runners. These were men who moved through a defined territory, a block, a few blocks, sometimes a neighborhood, collecting bets. A bet might be 50 cents. It might be $1. The runner recorded nothing in writing. He carried the money and the numbers in his memory. At the end of the day, he delivered the collected bets to a bookie. The bookie aggregated the bets from multiple runners. He tracked the exposure, the total liability on each possible 3-digit combination. He paid out the winners. He retained a percentage of the total handle, and he paid upward. The upward payment was the protection tax. In the Youngstown system, this payment moved through an intermediary layer, a figure who served as a buffer between the bookies and the organized crime leadership. This buffer figure collected the weekly tribute, reported the numbers to the organization, and served as the interface between the street-level operation and the political infrastructure above it. That political infrastructure was the mechanism that made everything possible. The arrangement with law enforcement was not informal. It was systematic. According to testimony developed in subsequent federal investigations, payments moved on a monthly basis to specific figures within the Mahoning County Sheriff's Department and the Youngstown Police Department. The amounts were calibrated to rank. A patrol officer received less than a sergeant less than a lieutenant less than the individuals who held command positions. The payments were not reported as bribes. They were described in the accounting of the criminal organization in the language of any other operating expense. What those payments purchased was specific. When a raid was planned, when a prosecutor or a reform-minded official pushed for enforcement action against a numbers operation, the warning moved through this relay. A political figure received information. That figure contacted the intermediary. The intermediary contacted the bookie contacted the runners. The operation went quiet for the duration of the heat. Then it resumed. The police department was not merely failing to enforce the law, it was actively functioning as an early warning system for the criminal organization it was nominally tasked with suppressing. At the time, none of this seemed unusual. Not in Youngstown, not in this specific configuration of interests and dependencies. The steelworkers needed entertainment, the bookies needed protection, the police needed supplemental income, the politicians needed campaign contributions and the votes of people who were invested, financially and socially, in the continuation of the existing arrangement. The city had delegated the management of its underworld to the underworld itself. And for years, that arrangement produced a kind of stability. It would be a mistake, however, to conclude that this stability was passive, that the arrangement merely persisted because no one challenged it. In 1952, a candidate running for Mahoning County Sheriff on an explicit anti-corruption platform received sufficient initial support to be considered a credible threat. He had begun developing relationships with federal contacts and assembling documentation of the payment relay. His candidacy collapsed before the election. The withdrawal of business endorsements, the surfacing of personal allegations, the drying up of campaign contributions from sources that had previously committed. These followed a pattern that federal investigators would later describe as consistent with coordinated suppression. He did not run again. The system that had been built in Mahoning County did not simply endure. It enforced its own continuity. It identified challenges before they became threats, and it resolved them through mechanisms that left no obvious fingerprints. This is the distinction between corruption that is merely tolerated and corruption that is defended. One is a condition, the other is an institution. The critical factor in that institutional stability was geography. Youngstown was not sovereign territory, it was a seam. To the west, in Cleveland, the dominant organized crime structure in Ohio maintained its base of operations, the Cleveland family, connected to the National Commission, the governing body of American organized crime established after the internecine wars of the early 1930s. had established what investigators would later describe as a sphere of influence across northern Ohio. Their reach extended to Youngstown, where they had relationships, interests, and claims. To the east, the Pittsburgh organized crime family maintained its own territorial logic. Western Pennsylvania had been Pittsburgh's for decades. Youngstown sat at the edge of that claim. The city occupied the space between them. This geography meant that the Mahoning Valley was, at all times, a negotiated space. Not formally negotiated. These were not diplomatic arrangements with written terms, but practically negotiated through precedent, through conversation, through the ongoing management of competing interests by men who understood that open conflict was bad for business. That negotiation required intermediaries, local figures who could interface with both Cleveland and Pittsburgh, who were trusted enough to receive tribute and transmit it, who understood the rules of a game that was never fully stated. It required, in other words, a class of Youngstown organized crime figures who were clients of both external powers simultaneously. This was inherently unstable, and the instability had a specific vulnerability: independent operators. The independent operator was the structural threat that the Youngstown system could not permanently contain. He was the bookmaker or numbers runner who had built his own operation, who had his own runners, his own bookies, his own territory, and who had, over time, come to question whether the protection tax he was paying was worth what it cost. Sandy Naples was, by most accounts, exactly this type of figure. Naples was a Youngstown bookmaker. He had built a modest but functioning criminal enterprise in the Mahoning Valley through the 1950s. He was not a boss. He was not connected to either Cleveland or Pittsburgh in any formal sense. He was, in the language of organized crime, an independent, a man who operated within the system's geography without being of the system. For years, this arrangement persisted. Naples paid what he was required to pay. He operated where he was permitted to operate. He was, from the perspective of the dominant structure, a minor figure, reliable in his payments, limited in his ambition. Then something changed. The precise nature of the dispute is, at this distance, not fully recoverable. The accounts that exist were produced by individuals with interests in how the story was told. What is documented is the outcome. At some point in the late 1950s, Naples made a decision. He would not continue to pay tribute at the level being demanded. Whether this was a principled position or a financial calculation, whether he believed the protection was no longer worth the cost, or whether he had simply decided that his operation was large enough to protect itself, is not clear from the record. What is clear is that the decision was communicated. There was a sit-down, a formal meeting, conducted according to the protocols of organized crime dispute resolution. Naples attended. The men he was meeting with, representatives of the Cleveland-Pittsburgh interest that controlled Youngstown, made their position clear. The tribute was not negotiable. The arrangement would continue as established. Naples left the meeting having agreed to nothing. There is also a cultural dimension to this conflict that should be stated clearly and carefully. The dominant figures in the Youngstown underworld at this period were, predominantly, of Sicilian descent. Naples and his associates came from a different Italian tradition, Calabrian, from the mainland rather than the island, within the closed social world of Italian-American organized crime in this period. These distinctions were not trivial. They were not the cause of the conflict. The cause was economic, but they shaped the vocabulary in which the conflict was understood, the language of loyalty, of respect, of obligation that different traditions encoded differently. The sit-down resolved nothing. Shortly thereafter, Sandy Naples was killed. The assassination was professional in its execution and clear in its message. Naples was dead. The independent path was closed. The hierarchy had enforced itself. What the men who ordered the killing did not anticipate, or more precisely, what they misjudged, was the response. Naples had people, associates, allies, men who were connected to him by business and by loyalty and by the simple logic that allowing his killing to go unanswered would invite further predation. The men who responded to his assassination were not acting from grief. They were acting from the cold arithmetic of self-preservation. That was the moment the rules stopped working. And the response, when it came, was a car bomb. The choice of methodology requires examination because it is not obvious and because it tells you something about the nature of the conflict that had just begun. In the American organized crime tradition of the post-war period, the dominant instrument of lethal violence was the handgun, deployed at close range in private or semi-private settings. It was efficient, it was discreet, and it left minimal forensic evidence beyond the bullet itself. It also carried a specific social meaning. It was personal, directed, and contained. A car bomb was none of these things. A car bomb was loud, it was public, it was indiscriminate enough to be genuinely dangerous to bystanders. It was difficult to control in terms of timing, and it generated a forensic signature, fragments, residues, blast patterns that a careful investigator could analyze. The decision to use a car bomb was a declaration of a different kind of war. It said, we are not bound by the usual conventions. We are willing to accept the collateral consequences. We are operating outside the framework of rules that normally governs how violence is used in this business. The first device was crude. It functioned, but it was the work of someone learning. The second device was better. The third was better still. What that progression concealed, for a time, was a failure of a different kind. Sometime in late 1961 or early 1962, the precise date is not established in the available record. A device was placed beneath a vehicle parked on the west side of Youngstown. The vehicle was a late model station wagon. It belonged to the wrong man. A grocery delivery driver, not connected to any faction in the conflict, had parked his car in the same block as the intended target. The vehicles were similar in model and color. In darkness, at speed, under operational pressure, a mistake was made. The driver arrived at his car the following morning, reached in through the driver's side window to retrieve a clipboard he had left on the seat the night before, and felt something beneath the seat with his foot. He described the object, later, as a metal box with wires. He did not understand what it was. He left it there. He drove his route. The device did not detonate. The fusing had failed, a dry cell battery that had discharged in the cold overnight. The driver returned home that evening and mentioned the metal box to a neighbor. The neighbor called the police. The responding officer, according to subsequent federal testimony, was among those receiving monthly payments from the criminal organization. The device was removed. The chain of custody was broken before it was established. The incident was not logged in a way that connected it to the ongoing bombing series. The delivery driver was never informed, officially, of what he had found beneath his seat. Seen in isolation, the detail appeared minor. It was not minor. It was a near-complete catastrophe that would have changed the political calculus of the entire conflict. A civilian killing, undeniable, photographed, impossible to manage quietly, would have brought federal intervention that the local law enforcement structure could not have deflected. The device failed, the cover worked, and the bombing campaign continued. How a captured institution functions under operational pressure, not as a conspiracy with a central coordinator issuing orders, but as a distributed system of individuals making decisions in their own interest. Decisions that, taken together, produce outcomes no single actor designed. Somebody was learning, and somebody was teaching. The name that investigators, years and sometimes decades later, would attach to the bombing campaign as its principal technical architect was Julius Moyo. Moyo does not appear in most popular accounts of the Youngstown conflict. The accounts that mention him at all tend to treat him as a minor figure, a technician, a footnote, a supporting character in a story whose protagonists were the bosses and the hitmen and the politicians whose names appeared in newspaper headlines. This is, in retrospect, a significant misreading. Because the bombing campaign that Julius Moyo is alleged to have designed and executed was not peripheral to the Youngstown mob war, it was its central mechanism. The bombs were how the conflict was conducted. The bombs were how territory was contested, how messages were sent, how individuals were eliminated. And Moyo, if the investigative record is to be believed, was the man who made the bombs work. He was also, by all available accounts, effectively invisible. No arrest record in connection with the Youngstown bombings during the period of active conflict. No prosecution, no public profile. He did not give interviews. He did not have a reputation that extended beyond the tightly defined circle of people who needed to know what he did for a living. He appears, in the records that exist, as an absence, a figure defined primarily by the spaces where evidence of his activity should have been and was not. The invisibility was not incidental, it was the product. A man who can be identified cannot be used indefinitely. A man who has no public presence, no known associates beyond the circle of people already invested in his work, no pattern of behavior that gives investigators a thread to pull. That man is an operational asset of a different order. His value is precisely proportional to his untraceability. In the language of intelligence analysis, Moyo was what you would call a ghost operative. He existed in the operational record without existing in the administrative one. The bombs he built showed up. He did not. But the bombs spoke. Forensic investigators who eventually compiled systematic analyses of the Youngstown cases noted something consistent across the devices attributed to Moyo's period of maximum activity. The underseat placement was the signature, not merely as a general approach, but in its specific execution. The wire gauge was consistent. The fusing approach was consistent. The amount of primary charge relative to the booster was consistent. These are not incidental similarities. They are the forensic equivalent of handwriting. A bomb is a manufactured object. Its construction reflects the habits, the training, the specific problem-solving approach of the person who built it, the discipline of someone who applies systematic logic to a manufacturing problem, who tests and retains what works, who improves across iterations because improvement is what disciplined craftsmen do. The underseat technique exploited the geometry of a standard American automobile. The explosion directed force upward. The driver's seat focused the blast into the most densely occupied part of the vehicle. The timing, using the ignition circuit, meant the device activated at the precise moment the target chose to leave, removing the operational complexity of predicting behavior. It was, in the cold terminology of forensic analysis, an efficient design. The numbers that accumulated across 6 years of this campaign are, in their own way, staggering. By various counts, the discrepancies reflecting the genuine difficulty of retrospective attribution, the absence of systematic record-keeping during the active period, and the reluctance of local law enforcement to cooperate with federal investigators asking uncomfortable questions. Somewhere between 75 and 82 bombing incidents occurred in the Mahoning Valley between 1960 and approximately 1966. Not a single conviction. To say that this outcome reflects institutional failure is accurate. It does not adequately describe the mechanism of that failure. The Mahoning County law enforcement apparatus during this period had been structured over years of systematic corruption to produce exactly this result. The patrol officers who responded to bombing scenes were, in many cases, receiving monthly payments from the criminal organization that had ordered the bombings. The investigators nominally tasked with building cases had been selected, in part, for their willingness to build cases that went nowhere. The prosecutors who received the files understood that certain files were not to be prosecuted. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is the documented conclusion of federal investigations conducted over the subsequent decades, supported by the testimony of participants who eventually decided, for reasons of self-preservation or conscience, or both, to cooperate with federal authorities. The forensic evidence that did exist was managed. Chain of custody failures, missing fragments, laboratory analyses that were incomplete, files transferred between offices and apparently misplaced, not the chaotic outcomes of an overwhelmed department operating with inadequate resources, the systematic outputs of an institution structured around different objectives than the ones printed on its letterhead. What did the residents of Youngstown experience during these years? They developed habits, something that does not appear in the official records but emerges in the oral history, the testimony of people who lived in the city during the bombing years. They checked under their cars before starting the engine. Not every time, perhaps, but the thought was there. The question. They varied their routes, not systematically, not with any real understanding of how targeting decisions were made, but the ambient awareness that a car bomb does not discriminate, that the device placed beneath your neighbor's vehicle might have its geometry somewhat wrong, that a person walking by at the wrong moment on the wrong morning was part of the risk calculation of the people building these devices. That awareness shaped behavior. Business owners in certain neighborhoods stopped parking in front of their own establishments. Children were instructed, without full explanation, not to approach unfamiliar cars. A city under systematic, unaddressed criminal violence looks like this from the inside. Not dramatic, not spectacular. A slow adjustment of daily behavior to accommodate a threat that the institutions responsible for eliminating it were not eliminating. Because the question that this evidence raises, the question that 82 unsolved bombings demands an answer to, is not primarily about organized crime. It is about governance. About what happens to a city when its institutions are captured. When they do not merely fail to function, failure is recoverable. But when they are actively restructured to serve interests opposed to those of the population they nominally represent. At this point, Youngstown wasn't a city. It was a laboratory for mob warfare. And the experiment was producing results that no one in a position of authority was particularly motivated to address. The national press found Youngstown in the mid-1960s. The Saturday Evening Post published an investigation. The language was measured, but the content was not. The piece described a city in which organized crime had achieved a level of integration that had ceased to be experienced locally as aberrant. Corruption, at sufficient depth and duration, normalizes itself. It becomes the operating assumption. It becomes, in the phrase the Post used, the way things work. Congressional attention followed. The Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, the institutional heir of the Kefauver Committee, which had conducted the first major national examination of organized crime in the early 1950s, turned its attention to Ohio. Witnesses were subpoenaed, documents were demanded. The structured silence that had protected the Mahoning County arrangement for decades began to develop fractures. Not because of the bombings themselves. The bombings had been occurring for years without producing congressional hearings. The mechanism of change was different. The mechanism was financial. Insurance companies operate on actuarial logic. Their business model requires the ability to predict, with reasonable confidence, the probability of a loss event occurring within a given geography. When the probability distribution becomes unmanageable, when a territory produces loss events that cannot be priced without destroying the viability of the policy, insurers withdraw. By the mid-1960s, significant portions of the Mahoning Valley had become, from the perspective of the insurance industry, effectively uninsurable at commercially viable rates. Businesses were paying premiums that reflected the genuine risk of having their vehicles destroyed. Some insurers declined to write policies in certain zip codes at any price. Commercial real estate in affected areas lost value. Businesses that could not obtain insurance at standard rates could not obtain conventional financing. Development projects stalled. Capital withdrew. Here is the logic of the Commission's intervention. Stated plainly, the mob does not care about justice. The mob does not care about the families of the men who were killed. The mob does not care about the children who are learning to check under cars before they get in. The mob cares about revenue. The mob cares about operational stability. And the mob cares, above all else, about the avoidance of what it calls heat, the investigative attention, the political scrutiny, the media coverage that creates pressure on public officials to act in ways that are inconvenient to criminal operations. Youngstown was generating heat at a level that could not be managed locally. The Commission's intervention was not a peace initiative. It was a business decision. The conflict had crossed a threshold beyond which it was costing the organization more than it was generating. The bombing campaign had destabilized the economic environment that the criminal operation depended on. The congressional hearings were creating federal investigative pressure that would eventually produce prosecutions. The war didn't stop because of a child. It stopped because investors were pulling out. The process of intervention moved through channels that are only partially visible in the historical record. What it did, according to testimony developed in subsequent federal proceedings, was make clear to the principals of both sides that the conflict would end, and that the terms of its ending would be determined at a level above the participants. The message that reached both the Cleveland and Pittsburgh sides was not framed as a request. It was framed as a statement of what was going to happen. And underlying that statement was an implicit logic that every man in the room understood. The Commission's protection, its capacity to shield affiliated organizations from federal attention, to resolve jurisdictional conflicts, to maintain the broader architecture of organized crime in America, was not unconditional. It was extended to members who operated in ways that served the collective interest. It could be withdrawn from members who generated heat that the collective interest could not absorb. Noncompliance with a commission directive was not simply a violation of protocol. It was a declaration that you were operating outside the protection structure entirely. In the world these men inhabited, operating without protection was not a viable condition. It was a countdown. The sit-down took place in Warren, Ohio. Warren is a small city approximately 20 miles northwest of Youngstown, in the same valley, neutral enough for the purpose. The meeting's participants included representatives of both the Cleveland and Pittsburgh organizational structures, along with the principal Youngstown figures who had survived the conflict and retained enough authority to make commitments on behalf of their respective factions. What was at stake in that room was more than the question of who controlled which numbers operations on which blocks. What was at stake was the question of whether either side, having expended resources, having lost men, having damaged its standing with the broader national organization through the conduct of a war that had attracted this level of attention, could afford to walk out without having gotten something. Whether a settlement could be structured that allowed both sides to describe the outcome to their own people as something other than capitulation. This is the specific challenge of organized crime dispute resolution, the same logic of violence that sustains the organization's authority in normal circumstances becomes a constraint in negotiation. You cannot easily tell your own men that you are accepting less than what you were fighting for. The solution, in Warren, was territorial clarity. A line was drawn on an invisible map, specific operations, specific revenue streams, specific geographic areas were assigned to specific organizations. The assignments were not entirely equal, but they were definitive. The ambiguity that had made the Mahoning Valley a contested space, the seam between Cleveland and Pittsburgh claims, was replaced by a specific, if unwritten, understanding. The bombing slowed. Then, substantially, they stopped. And the men who had spent years in a state of managed anticipation, checking under their cars, varying their routes, listening for the distant sound that meant someone's vehicle had just been destroyed, slowly, over months, adjusted their behavior back towards something approaching normal. The war was over, but the damage was not. This is the point at which the story of the Youngstown mob war is typically closed. The narrative ends with the sit-down, the territorial settlement, the cessation of hostilities. These accounts are structurally incomplete because the most consequential chapter of the Youngstown story is not the bombing campaign. The most consequential chapter is what happened after the bombing campaign ended. The steel industry that had made Youngstown was already, by the mid-1960s, under structural pressure, international competition from rebuilt European and Japanese capacity, from producers in countries with lower labor costs and more recent technology, was making American integrated steel production progressively less competitive. This was a national phenomenon. Dozens of American industrial cities faced versions of this challenge. What distinguished Youngstown's response was not the economic pressure itself. That pressure was common. What distinguished Youngstown was the condition of its institutions. A city facing deindustrialization needs municipal government that can make credible commitments to investors about the regulatory and security environment. It needs civic organizations capable of mobilizing collective action. It needs a political class that represents, at least partially, the interests of the people who live within its jurisdiction rather than the interests of the criminal organizations that have purchased access to its functions. Youngstown, in the late 1960s and through the 1970s, had none of these things in the form they were needed. The congressional hearings had produced some prosecutions. Individual officials had been charged, convicted, removed from office. But prosecution of individuals does not transform institutional culture. The relationships between organized crime and political authority in the Mahoning Valley were not held in place by specific individuals. They were held in place by a logic of economic dependency, of normalized expectation, of structural arrangement that survived the removal of any particular person. When Youngstown Sheet and Tube announced mass layoffs in September 1977, the event that became known locally as Black Monday, the city did not have the capacity to absorb the impact. 5,000 jobs eliminated in a single announcement. More to follow. The parking lots outside the sheet and tube plant on Campbell Road filled up one morning and never filled up the same way again. The mill gates were locked in sequence, one by one. Over the months that followed, men who had carried lunch pails to the same entrance for 20 years found the entrance closed. The geography of daily life in the Mahoning Valley reorganized itself around an absence. The population figures record what happened next with a precision that narrative cannot match. Youngstown in 1950, approximately 168,000 people. Youngstown in 1970, approximately 140,000. Youngstown in 1980, approximately 115,000. Youngstown in 1990, approximately 96,000. Youngstown in 2000, approximately 82,000. Youngstown in 2020, approximately 60,000. Not ordinary urban decline. What happened to Youngstown represents a different category, a collapse of civic capacity that accelerated decline beyond what the economic disruption alone would have produced. The businesses that might have located in Youngstown made different decisions when they examined the Mahoning Valley. They had read the congressional testimony. They had seen the insurance industry's actuarial assessments. They were evaluating the credibility of the local government's commitments on taxation, regulation, and public safety. The evaluation was not favorable. Capital went elsewhere. The population that remained was, disproportionately, the population with the fewest options for leaving. The young, the skilled, the mobile. They left. What was left was an aging population, a declining tax base, and a physical infrastructure. Schools, roads, utilities, civic buildings, built for a city of 168,000 people and now serving a city of steadily diminishing size. Federal enforcement efforts through the 1970s and 1980s, using the tools provided by the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, eventually produced significant prosecutions. Organized crime figures in Youngstown and in Cleveland were convicted. Operations were disrupted. But criminal justice prosecutions of individuals do not reconstruct civic culture. They establish individual accountability for specific acts. They do not address the deeper structures, the patterns of expectation, the networks of dependency, the normalized assumptions about how decisions get made that persist beneath any particular set of actors. Youngstown's political culture, after the prosecutions, was not transformed. It was diminished, which is not the same thing. Youngstown didn't lose a war. It lost its future. The 12-year-old boy who was standing on the sidewalk near the north side on November 23, 1962, the boy who described the sky coming apart, grew up in that city. He watched the mills close. He watched the downtown hollow out. He watched neighbors leave, storefronts empty. Houses that had been family homes for 2 generations become abandoned structures that the city eventually demolished. He did not speak publicly about what he had seen on that Saturday afternoon for more than 60 years. Then, in his 70s, he agreed to meet with an FBI agent who was working on a historical accounting of the Youngstown bombing campaign. There was no prosecution to be opened, no accountability to be delivered in the conventional sense. The men responsible had been identified, in some cases prosecuted for other crimes, in most cases had died. What the meeting represented was something more limited. A man who had been a child near an explosion choosing, after 6 decades, to say what he knew to a person who represented the institution that had, by his observation, by the evidence of his entire life in that city, failed to do what it was supposed to do. Whether that constitutes a form of resolution is a question that resists clear answer, which is, in its own way, the right answer to arrive at. Because the story of Youngstown does not resolve. The mob survived. The families that controlled the numbers operations and the gambling houses. They outlasted the steel mills, outlasted the congressional hearings, outlasted the prosecutions that eventually came. The men who ordered the bombings, most of them, died in their beds. The men who enabled them were replaced by other men. The structures remained. And the city they fought over, the city that had been the prize, the revenue source, the territory worth bombing for, contracted, year by year, into something smaller than what it had been. That is not a conclusion. That is a structure. A structure in which the cost of what was built in Mahoning County is borne not by the men who built it, but by the people who lived within it. 168,000 people built something in the Mahoning Valley. They built mills and schools and churches and neighborhoods. They raised children in houses that their labor had paid for. The arrangements that were made above them determined what remained. The record of those arrangements is now held in federal court files and congressional archives and the oral histories of people who are, most of them, very old now. It simply documents a city that was 168,000 people and is now 60,000. A place where 82 bombs went off and no one was convicted. A place where the machinery of governance was restructured over years into an instrument of the interests it was supposed to oppose. A laboratory. The experiment concluded. The results were not ambiguous.